Wing Chun wooden dummy, or Jong, is a very unique piece of training equipment. It was brought to Hong Kong via the legacy of Grandmaster Yip Man when he arrived there in 1949. Initially, Grandmaster Yip Man didn't have a dummy that he could teach his students, but of course it wasn't long before they started pestering him about learning the wooden dummy. Story goes that he'd actually forgotten a lot of his Wing Chun training because Yip Man had trained to become his art. He had no intention of being a teacher and had done very little teaching apart from a handful of students in the mainland. So when he was suddenly put in a position where he was going to be an instructor of the art, he had to remember a lot of the things that he'd forgotten himself, things that he'd deliberately pushed to the back of his mind. And the wooden dummy was no exception. In fact, probably the wooden dummy was the most difficult thing for him to recall, because he had learned to play the dummy as a freestyle exercise. He would basically just play with it, and whatever came to his mind and whatever he felt about the dummy, he would just do it as a very free sequence. So when it was time to actually try to teach the technique of the wooden dummy to his students, it was a case of thinking, wow, how was that sequence? Which way did it go? One of the things that he was up against was the fact that the dummy had in fact changed in his lifetime. When he was learning the dummy himself from his teacher Chan Wai Soon and his senior students, or Chan Wai Soon's senior students, what he had learned was one interpretation of the dummy which gradually started changing. Chan Wai Soon himself felt that the dummy had been put together in the wrong order to make it an effective tool. And so what he did was, after a period of time, he reversed the order and he put what he considered were the most useful and most basic tools at the beginning and put the other techniques further towards the end of the form. That created a form that was mostly about 50% Sin Tao Chum Kill ideas, and then the final 50% or so of the form was more ideas that lent themselves to Bilji thinking, the third form of Wing Chun. The Muk Yan Zong itself is a wooden dummy. Quite literally, the word Muk Yan Zong means wooden man pile. It's a very simple piece of apparatus with a body made of wood, 3 arms representing arms and leg techniques, and a leg as well, and is used to practice striking, controlling, and other aspects of Wing Chun. When Grandmaster Yip Man was training in China, his dummy was the traditional style. That was, it was mounted in the ground. It was literally buried in the ground to a certain level so that it was a very solid, non-moving piece of equipment. It meant that the way you played the dummy was quite different to the way that the dummy is played these days. These days, the dummy is considered a live dummy because it has some play, some movement. It's mounted on a frame, which means it has spring backwards and forwards. It also has a reasonable amount of movement laterally from left to right. So the feedback that you get from the dummy now is very different. So the first thing that Yip Man had to do when he brought the dummy, or had a dummy made for him in Hong Kong, was to find a way to mount it, because you couldn't go sticking a dummy in the floor of the apartment buildings where people lived in Hong Kong. It just wasn't a possibility. They invented a frame which was mounted directly to the wall, and it enabled the dummy to be mounted at different levels so that a taller person or a shorter person could adjust it accordingly. A lot of the footage that remains and photograph that remains of the Grandmaster playing the dummy was actually shot on a dummy that was set up for somebody else, not for him. So if you watch the movements very closely, you'll see that he's actually working at a level which isn't very much too high for him. Sadly, a lot of people treat that last little bit of footage in those photographs as the gospel, according to Yip Man. And that's a big mistake because, of course, firstly, the man was very ill when that footage was shot, days away from dying from cancer. And so the last thing on his mind was probably to get out of the sick bed and start playing with the dummy. And the second problem is, of course, that the height of the dummy is not his natural height. So a lot of the angles that he uses don't really reflect the way that he would probably use the techniques. Putting that aside, it's still excellent to see him play the dummy and to get an idea of the rhythm involved. You can see that when Yip Man plays the dummy, he's not trying to belt the hell out of it. He's also not moving at a quick pace. It's a steady, regular rhythm. And that's the way that the dummy should be played, much the same as the other forms in Wing Chun should be played. But getting back to how the dummy was first taught by Yip Man, we remember that when he first tried to do it, he had to go back and search his mind for the actual sequence. And there's a funny story that my teacher told that relates how several of the students found a room adjacent to where Yip Man was practicing, which was looking down from a slight angle from where he was working. It was across a kind of a courtyard or a mezzanine level. And they hid in the room and peered through the window, and they would report how Yip Man would play the dummy, and then scratch his head as if to say, no, that's not right, and he'd go back to doing it again, and he was gradually trying to rebuild in his mind what the dummy form was all about. It goes a long way to explaining why different generations of people who learned from Yip Man seem to have a different type of wooden dummy sequence. They argue about the number of techniques, they argue about the angles, they argue about the order of the sequences, all of which really isn't really that important. Grandmaster Yip Man, like anybody who trains Wing Chun, was constantly refining his techniques. And there's no way that what he was teaching in the later years was any worse than what he was teaching in the earlier years. It was probably actually a better version of the dummy based on what he developed as a man getting older, perhaps losing some of his power, but still wanting to get the most out of his body in order to be effective in using the techniques. The same can be said for myself. I'm sure that my dummy has changed ever so slightly from what I learned from my teacher, because it's adapted to me and I've adapted to it. And more importantly, what my teacher taught. Master Wong Sin Leung taught a dummy form that was quite different to the form taught to many of the students by Grandmaster Yip Man. And there's a very simple reason. He went out into the streets of Hong Kong and was testing his skills under real conditions. And he discovered during those famous Beimo or challenge fights that a lot of the techniques practiced on the dummy form didn't really work in the way that the dummy showed them. Because people change. The dummy form was a fixed idea, but the way people move and fight is constantly changing. And some of the techniques were done in a way that might work against a stationary opponent, but need to be modified to work against a moving opponent. And some of them were just found to be downright lacking in application, because they were ideas based on not real combat situations, but upon people's thoughts of what combat might be. After being in combat and discovering what happens in a fight, my Sifu found that many of the ideas in the dummy needed a little bit of tweaking, a little bit of modification to make them more practical and more efficient, more up-to-date, if you like. So I can safely say without any regret or any embarrassment, actually with a lot of pride, that the wooden dummy form as taught by Master Wong Sin Leung was in fact a dummy form that is useful for practical fighting as fighting occurs today. And as with all the things that my teacher taught, he taught the wooden dummy as a concept-based tool. Not set movements, set sequences or set ideas, but a series of guidelines which can be adapted and modified to suit the occasion, to blend with the opponent and to be used as needed rather than having to apply them A, B, C or 1, 2, 3 fashion. So what you'll see on this DVD when we break down the form in its intricate movements and break it down to ideas and concepts and applications will be a dummy form that is somewhat different to the form taught by the Grandmaster Yip Man, but keeping the essence of the dummy form that the Grandmaster taught. As I was saying a moment ago, the number of techniques is not really a major detail. As my teacher said many, many times, we're learning how to fight, we're not learning mathematics. Numbers don't matter. He also said if you get the sequence wrong, as long as you haven't left anything out, that doesn't matter either, because we're not training a sequential fighting system. We're training tools that can be put in any combination. So you may not agree at first view of what I'm saying about the dummy. You might think that things should be in a different order. You might think that the number of techniques I apply is wrong, or not as many, or too many. But try to step away from that thinking and look at what I'm presenting when we go through the form, and look at the ideas, look at the concepts, look at the practicality of what's being presented, and then you'll get an idea of what Wong Sin Leung's Wing Chun was all about. So I hope you enjoy this presentation of the wooden dummy. I hope it makes some sense to you, and I hope that there's something there that you can take away to use in your own combat training, whether it be in Wing Chun or in another martial art. Remember, this is information that's out there for you to take and use as you wish. I'm not telling you how to do it. I'm not telling you that you're wrong and I'm right. This is just one interpretation which is there for you to assess and use at your discretion. I hope you'll enjoy the presentation. Thank you.